He felt that because of sexism, that women ought to be encouraged by their husbands to have lovers, and that they should be supported by their husbands.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 25 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. Our newest broadcaster is in Waterbury, Connecticut. Welcome to folks in the Brass City. We're also shown on a website, thestruggle.org, and our YouTube channel, The Struggle Video Media. We start with an Israeli sniper team having fun. They're not in Gaza, they're in the West Bank city of Hebron. Watch at the top of the screen, you'll see a blue line. That's about a block away from where they are, and that's where the youth is that they wound.
Hit him.
L'ha preso. Il sciabezzino. Oh fuck. Oh fuck.
See, look at that. He's congratulating him.
Believe it or not, the snipers insisted on being photographed by a man they knew to be affiliated with the International Solidarity Movement. There's no limit to their arrogance because they know they have the full backing of the U.S. Congress and President. There's a fine Israeli human rights group called the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, better known by its Hebrew acronym, B'Tselem. On their website, it came across this picture. This is the site of perhaps the worst single atrocity of the recent Gaza attack. This was an apartment building that was home to 50 people. According to B'Tselem, on the morning of July 29, Israeli forces bombed the 4-story building, causing the deaths of 35 people. Wada Abu Amr, a leader of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, lived in the building. He was killed, along with his wife and 5 children. Their ages ranged from 9 to 2 years old. On the site of B'Tselem, they write, B'Tselem will continue to investigate the incident, yet even at this early juncture, it can be stated that the bombing of the building was unlawful. There can be no justification for the deaths of so many civilians, including 18 minors and 8 women. Israel repeatedly claims that it has no intention of harming civilians. However, after more than 3 weeks of lethal bombardments by Israel in the Gaza Strip, which have killed hundreds of civilians and wiped out dozens of families, this claim has become meaningless. B'Tselem also has a section on human shields, not the lies of Israeli propaganda, but the real story about how cowardly Israeli troops would grab Palestinians to use as shields when they would raid a building. There was even a court order from the Israeli High Court forbidding the practice, going way back to August of 2002. That brings us to a despicable resolution passed by the U.S. House of Representatives, H-Con 107, which faithfully echoes Israeli propaganda and denounces Hamas for using human shields. It claims that Palestinians shoot missiles from densely populated areas and near schools, hospitals, and mosques. The real shielding is the shielding Congress gives for IDF atrocities. In Connecticut, all 5 members of the House gave Israel the green light for its attacks. But only Rosa DeLauro went the extra mile to give cover for the bombing of civilian targets by co-sponsoring HCON 107. On August 13th, we picketed her New Haven headquarters.
We are here because Congressman Rosa DeLauro has offices in this building, and she's been a total supporter of the Israeli attack on Palestinians. 1,900 human beings killed in just a month. Millions of your money going for this. Children, 400 children, mosques, hospitals, everything attacked.
People all over the world are appalled by what is happening in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories. The people are under occupation. The people have been all over the streets in London, in Athens, everywhere in Spain, everywhere by the thousands, talking about this massacre of people and children, over 400 children, absolutely blown to smithereens. I guess we don't care that much about it because we had our children, 23 of them, in Newtown, Connecticut, and we still have not been able to do something about the guns in this country where they're flooding our streets and killing our children and young men and everybody that they can see. So we better go home and think about what we stand for and do something about it, for God's sakes.
We're here as Americans to express our outrage at Congress's and Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro's support of Israeli occupation, siege, and collective punishment of Palestinian people. I'm here as a Jew to express my outrage and my anguish at the Israeli distortion and corruption of Jewish values. It's not a Jewish value to slaughter the innocent. It's not a Jewish value to demolish people's houses. It's not a Jewish value to build a wall between communities, farming communities, separating them from their land and then confiscating their land because it's not being worked. It's not a Jewish value to arrest people without charge and detain them indefinitely without charge. It's not a Jewish value to incite your population to racist and murderous acts against other people that are in your same land. Rabbi Henry Siegman, who used to be head of the executive director of the American Jewish Congress and is from a family that escaped from Nazi Germany in the 1930s, said that the biggest lesson from the Holocaust was not that people do evil things. The biggest lesson is a cultured population that does not act against those evil things. David Ben-Gurion in 1948 said that there's no way that we will ever let the Palestinians return to their land, and he also said that the old will die and the young will forget about it. And let me tell you, the young have not forgotten about it, and they will resist for as long as they need to recover from the tragedy that was put upon them by the Israelis and the Zionists when they destroyed over 500 Palestinian villages in 1948. So we are here to express our outrage to Rosa. Rosa, you have been a good congressperson for us for many years, but you have let us down on this issue. You have supported Israeli criminal acts, and we really need for you to change your view of this whole situation. Masaya, it's enough already. Take a stand. Do something. Stand up for human values.
We're here because our elected officials have completely let us down and continue to do that. Not just Rosa, but all of Congress and the Senate, the House, in continuing to fund the aggression and the occupation of Israel. Friends don't let friends drive drunk. But the United States is letting Israel not just drive drunk, but commit war crimes with their funding and continued funding. Those dollars, $3.1 billion and more each year that go to Israel for military weapons and to fund their slaughter of Palestinians, are dollars that come from our pockets, and many of them go back to the defense contractors in this country. Public dollars that go to private corporations in this country. We have to say no to that. But while our leaders are letting us down, and I might point out that I recently learned that several of our senators and several of our congresspeople have dual citizenship with Israel, they should recuse themselves from any policy decisions. While our leaders are letting us down, there are many things we can do in addition to this protesting. We can support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which has been called for by Christian Palestinians who wrote a Kairos document in 2005 supporting that movement that was started by Omar Barghouti and others. We need to say our dollars will not go to supporting companies that, like Caterpillar, like Motorola, like Hewlett-Packard, and many more that are equipping Israel in its occupation. We need to support that movement because when it costs Israel too much, maybe finally they'll begin to act like human beings. But right now, our government leaders are not calling for that. They have let us down. We, the people, have to act in a way that will change Israel. We have to support the Palestinians and speak out against these war crimes. We have a problem in this country. It's called being progressive, except for Palestine. Progressive, except for Palestine. That is one way to describe our dear Congresswoman, Rosa DeLauro. She is, in many respects, a wonderful Congresswoman. But when it comes to Palestine, all she has to say is Hamas. Hamas is the problem. But the occupation is much older than Hamas. Hamas is not the problem. The colonization and occupation of Palestine is the problem.
Long live Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
From the river to the sea,
From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free.
Palestine will be free.
From the river to the sea,
From the river to the sea,
Palestine will be free.
Palestine.
So I think I'm either getting cracked with like Jake or Sherry or something like that.
Toward the end of the picket, a group of 5 Israelis drove up in several cars, and a heated argument went on for some time.
Don't curse. Please don't curse.
Note the fellow crying out the word anti-Semitism. When anyone, anywhere criticizes Israel, an Israeli will start whining about anti-Semitism. When several people on the line identified themselves as Jews, the response was psychobabble, that these people were self-hating Jews. We learned a lesson. The followers of the cult of the State of Israel are getting ever more aggressive. Be prepared. Keep yourself safe. I'm going to show you photos from a demonstration in Hawaii on August 13th called Stop U.S. Support for Israel. It was called by the Hawaii Coalition for Justice in Palestine and brought out some 100 people. They picketed Secretary of State Kerry when he spoke at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. Many native Hawaiians consider Hawaii occupied territory. The land was taken from an independent kingdom by the U.S. in the 1890s. A group at the protest called Movement for Aloha no Ka'aina ended their remarks with these words: "To rub salt in the wound, the U.S. military uses our lands to prepare armies around the world to do to other people what they have essentially done to us. It is both dehumanizing and humiliating to not have control of one's own country, to not be able to determine whether our sacred Aina will produce food or whether she will be forced into the production of U.S. wars. We're both outraged and strengthened as we witness the Palestinians' own commitment to struggle to maintain their ancestral connection to the land. And we are committed to continue to struggle in Hawaii to liberate ourselves and our lands toward the liberation of all victims of U.S. empire." Last week, we showed you this photo of two young men, one a Palestinian and one a Jew, who had both been brutalized in Jerusalem at different times. I didn't know the name of the Jewish American at the time. His name is Lucas Kerner. In poking around, I found out that he had the rare honor of being caricatured by the Brazilian cartoonist Carlos Latuff. Speaking of Latuff, this is one of his newer cartoons about Gaza, showing that what went on was not really a war, but the typical act of the old-time conquistador. Here's another cartoon that goes back a while. I was not really sure whether I should use it. It compares the IDF to World War II Germans. But after the latest rampage, I'm not unsure anymore. After the latest assault, how can we deny the similarities? Now to the Left Forum back in May and a talk by Richard Greeman about fiction and activism.
I'm Richard Greeman. I'm best known for translating the novels of Victor Serge, the Franco-Russian revolutionary and novelist who was active in the first part of the 20th century. Now, what I have to say, I'll start with a question. Who wrote What Is to Be Done? Wrong! Okay, I was waiting for the chance to say that. It was written by Nikolai Chernyshevsky in the middle or late in the 19th century, okay? And Lenin borrowed his title of a very, very famous book that created a lot of radicals, okay? Chernyshevsky was the greatest of the feminist writers, and he also lived feminism. He felt that because of sexism, that women ought to be encouraged by their husbands to have lovers, and that they should be supported by their husbands when they have lovers. And he actually did that. And his book talks about creating a new type of person in the midst of czarist autocracy and the most oppressive, backward society, arguably, in Europe. Not arguably the most backward society, arguably in Europe. And many people changed their lives because they read What Is to Be Done. And of course, there's also Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, which with the character of Bazarov, the new man, was another such an inspiration. And many of you may know that Lenin's older brother was a member of the People's Will Party, and he was hanged for an attempt at assassination, or a conspiracy anyway, to assassinate the Tsar. So here we have, from the very origins of the big revolution of the 20th century, the influence influence of fiction. And Len borrowed that title because he thought it would be catchy for his pamphlet on how to organize a revolutionary party under circumstances of illegality. So Victor Serge is the writer, of course, that I'm most intimately connected with, and he comes out of this whole Russian tradition of populism, because people's will or people's freedom, those are the alternate translations of that movement. He talks about Chernyshevsky in his second novel, which is called Birth of Our Power. And it's a novel that talks about a revolution that starts to take place in Spain in 1917. And then the narrator, who is a kind of fictionalized version of Serge himself, ends up in a concentration camp and then ends up in Russia. But here he talks about Chernyshevsky, who was arrested and broken, and here he is standing on a pillory, about to be sent off to Siberia. And Serge writes, on May 19th, 1864, a low black scaffold was raised on a seldom frequented square in St. Petersburg, and it had a pillory on it. And on it is a 35-year-old man, thin and pale, blonde, with a pointed beard and a look of concentration behind a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles. He was made to climb the scaffold, and there's more description here, and I don't want to take too much time. The crowd could only hear a feeble murmur of words. Horses were snorting. The rain was falling noiselessly, endlessly washing the impoverished faces and things. And the executioner appears, and they break the guy's sword over his head, and he's humiliated in every way possible. And it says, Serge writes, he was at once powerful and impotent, like the mind itself. Informers, publicists, forgers, secret agents, factotum senators. The emperor himself had conspired to bring him low. Under this interminable reign, attached to that pillory, he was ending his career as a thinker for whom the world was not only to be understood, but also to be transformed. His book, written in a cell, was to survive. He lived alone for 20 years in Siberian hamlets. And Serge goes on to say, every event is the result of an endless chain of causes. And this, too, at a distance of a half century, appears to me as a cause. Chernyshevsky in chains, wiping off his glasses in order to see the faces of life, listening to the dull rumblings of the crowd under the rain, explains for me the victory of millions of men on the march, besieging palaces, winning over squadrons and fortresses with harangues, burning the lords' manor houses, hanging the hangman, finally declaring peace on the world, and covered with opprobrium by the muzzled, slaughtered, and bamboozled peoples. And he goes on to say, there is always in the depths of the soul, in its secret folds, an insidious voice which would like to argue, yes, but the man on the pillory was lost. His intelligence was extinguished, like a useless fire set by lightning in the Siberian wilds. It neither guides nor warms anyone. Humanity on the march has endless centuries to live. Chernyshevsky had only one life. And then Serge concludes, wouldn't he have lost a great deal more had he ended up as an academician? So this is a situation, and Serge, in 1928, after having served the Russian Revolution in all kinds of capacities, mostly as a publicist, but also as an historian and writer, he was to the French reading public what John Reed was, if he had lived on to the 20s, to the U.S. public. That is to say, the person that brought the news from nowhere, that defended the Soviets and talked about the revolution. But Serge was a rebel. He was an early opponent of bureaucracy and a fighter against Stalinism, and he ended up also being sent into Siberia. But before he became a novelist. He was expelled from the party. He could no longer do the practical nonfiction work. And he thought that finally the period of reaction and decline could last a long time, and that his best contribution that he could make after the years of observation and participation and struggle was to write fiction. He had written history. He wrote the first actual history of the Russian Revolution published in the West. But he said that history could tell things that the fiction could tell things that history couldn't. And so he wrote to a correspondent in France, a few truthful fictions, I like that oxymoron, could do more right now than anything else to help build characters, because he was looking at the future. He was looking at the formation of minds. And it's true that Serge's books, which keep getting knocked out and then revived every time there's a beginning of agitation any place around the world, they have kept the feeling, the actuality of what it was like to be there. Serge never wrote, like many of the people, the theoreticians, that Russia had become state capitalist or bureaucratic collectivist or any of these other things. He said he'd just as soon leave that to amateurs of pure theory. He described what it was like to be a worker or to be a peasant, and he described the conflicts as they're actually experienced and felt. And so his books will last longer, it seems to me, than the great works of the theoreticians. Not that I'm putting down Marxist theory. I just spoke at a panel on Marx's ideas of alternatives to capitalism, and they're very, very important. But also Marge Piercy, and also Edward Bellamy, who in 1880-something wrote a novel called Looking Backwards that swept across the country. And Edward Bellamy clubs, which were the origins of all the socialist parties and movements, were all over on college campuses and around on the Chautauqua circles. And then because his version of socialism was a rather authoritarian and mechanistic one, we get William Morris in England writing News from Nowhere, presenting a much more softer and more humanistic version. So it seems to me that fiction appeals to the guts, it appeals to the imagination, it appeals to our emotions, and it contrary to postmodernism or anything else that says that we can't know each other, and that we can't know anything about other people. That's what the imagination is for. That's what fiction writers do. And I just think of my own adolescence, picking up books like Malraux's Man's Fate, about the Chinese Revolution, and Hemingway on the Spanish Civil War, and John Dos Passos, when I first read USA, and where he talks about the lynching of the IWW Wobblies, and things like that. It just galvanized me. It transformed my mind. I was a middle-class boy, students, with not a huge experience of the world, but this provided my mind with images, with characters, with furniture that enabled me to understand the world. And so I'm saying fiction is very, very important for the formation of characters. And that people sometimes flip around when they're become radicals because of a theory. Because, as Epicurus says, for every theory there's a counter theory. But when you've experienced what it was like, for example, to be oppressed under a Stalinist so-called socialist regime by an author who's clearly a revolutionary, then you're not likely to go back on that. Thank you very much.
We have a listserv devoted to the subject. It's called The Fiction Front. To join it, just drop us a line at mail@thestruggle.org. We don't want to close without showing you this photo, taken at Howard University. Hundreds of people with their hands up to imitate the last act of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, before he was killed by police. Predictably, President Obama appealed for calm and reflection. Luckily, this was ignored, and people took to the streets and protested. And as we record on August 15th, the heavily militarized police occupation in Ferguson has been relaxed. And by the way, the last police chief of Ferguson got trained in, of all places, you guessed it, in Israel. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.